Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. As most of you know, this is political season, and today's guest is Scott Milne, who is running for Lieutenant Governor. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you, Mr. Wheeler.
I'm not sure if you've ever been on this show before. Possibly the last time you ran actually for governor, possibly you came on my radio show. I'm not quite certain.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we've been together twice, I think, before, Scott.
Right. So you ran for governor back, what year was that?
2014.
2014. And I think you came out, you shocked everybody. You shocked the pundits. And you were how far from winning?
2,400 votes,
yeah, and
1.2, who's counting, but 1.2%, I think, Scott.
Were you surprised even?
We knew going into that, just to delve, had a very interesting campaign team and built a good organization that really gelled. And we did, if you think about 6 years ago, it was sort of like prehistoric times for social media.
Right.
Facebook actually had analytics in 2014 where they tracked every congressional race, every U.S. Senate race, every governor's race in the country. So they were tracking about 600 races. And the primary metric was engagement, which is people that are taking content you're putting on your Facebook site and then sharing it.
Right.
And for the last 3 weeks of 2014, the top 3 races out of those 600 in the country, Mitch McConnell, who had about 10 times as many friends as we did, but had as many people engaged. Scott Brown in Massachusetts, who again was running a $20 million campaign, had about 10 times more friends than we had, if I recall correctly, and had about the same number of people engaged. And then us, who had about, I think we had about 12,000 friends. And on average, it was dynamic. As you were looking at that page, it would go up and down. We had about 9,000 people throughout the last 3 weeks of that campaign engaged. So to answer your question, we walked into that election night celebration feeling very, very good that we were going to win. And came up, lost the closest governor's race in 200 years, but we reached a lot of people. I think we, 2 years longer than I wanted to, but, I felt like Peter Shumlin, a lot of things I respect about Peter Shumlin, but he was a reckless governor and I think was ruining our state. That's why I got into the race. It was a referendum on Peter Shumlin. As you recall, right. He shortly after that election announced his political career was over. So it took a couple of years longer. I would have liked to have been governor, but I feel like we accomplished something with that campaign, and it was a lot of fun. Got to meet a lot of good people like you.
My theory about former Governor Shumlin's departure from politics, I know he would disagree with me, but I believe it was you caused him to second guess his serving, because I think that had to have rocked him to the core, and he just said, he saw the writing on the walls that I think he's going to go down as one of the least respected governors in our time, and I just didn't think he wanted to go against somebody again.
I think you're right, and I think the big one of the big accomplishment I believe of that Scott Milne 2014 campaign was, if you recall, we had this what I would argue reckless experiment with our health care, and we had elected Peter Shumlin twice with the promise of, don't worry, I'll tell you after the election how much it's going to cost and how I'm going to pay for it. And, that worked in 2010 because it was his first election. It should not have worked, in my opinion, in 2012. I think he pulled the wool over our eyes. And then he got limped through that 2014. But between Election Day and January, as you recall, nobody had 50%, and the Vermont Constitution says the legislature decides. So between Election Day and January, he actually had to come clean and say it was going to be a 15% payroll tax or whatever it was going to be. I think the Democrats in the legislature forced him to do that if they were going to support him in that, and that ended his career.
Right. So, and for the sake of disclosure, I actually, in my time of serving in legislature, I served under Governor Douglas and Governor Shumlin, and I was on the health care committee at the time of when all this was coming out, and it was basically, well, don't ask too many questions.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, I think my fault, and I think there's too much special interest money in elections, and there's too much need the way elections are funded in Vermont and America right now for politicians to just spend so much time sucking up to people with money to fund their next election. And Again, there's a lot of things I respect about Peter Shulman, and he's not governor anymore. But I think what I saw with Peter Shulman was a guy who flies around the country to cocktail parties with rich special interest people, getting ideas and bringing them back to Vermont to sort of treat us like we're a bunch of guinea pigs in some left-wing experiment to figure out how to further his political career or further the interests of people that are funding his campaigns. I think that's wrong, and I'm really proud of the campaign we have going this year. There's not a lot of out-of-state money in. There's not a lot of special interest money in. My opponent's got a lot of lobbyist Washington, D.C. money. You can tell where, that career is going to go if it gets off the ground with this race. I'm hoping we're going to be successful. Looks like it's going to be a close election.
Right. Who is Scott Milne?
Scott Milne is as I say, I have my daughter Elise here with me, who's come home from. She lives in Puerto Rico, but has come home for the last few weeks of the campaign to help me out. She's been part of the last two campaigns, as has been my son. And my children are lucky enough to be the sixth generation of our family to be able to say Vermont is their home. So I've got a long history in Vermont. Moved home about 30 years ago and bought a small branch of my family's travel business, actually in New Hampshire. And as you know, if I was doing just what was smart economically, I would have lived in New Hampshire, right? Would have had more money today. But I built that business. I wanted to live in Vermont. Built a family in Vermont. Kids have been fortunate enough to grow up in Vermont. I'm in this race for Lieutenant Governor, Scott, primarily for two reasons. One, I think as we come out of the health crisis that we're in and get to work on rebuilding our economy, Phil Scott really needs, and I hope Vermont feels like they deserve that Phil Scott has a partner, not an adversary in the Lieutenant Governor's office. And secondly, I'm in that small business I bought a little over 3 decades ago with one part-time employee. Coming into COVID was about 100 people. So I've, got experience building jobs and growing, businesses on. We've got 3 retail offices in Vermont and a network of offices that goes from Westchester County, New York, up through Bangor, Maine. So I get how the economy works. I think that's an underrepresented skill set in Montpelier. You may recall that a little bit from your time there. Even in good times, but we're not in good times at all right now. So I think Phil Scott needs a partner, and Vermont needs somebody that kind of knows how the economy works. And I think we also, really need to acknowledge that it's not like we're coming into this COVID crisis with a robust economy. We've got a aging population, shrinking workforce. There's fewer people working in Vermont today than there was 20 years ago. That's not a good sign.
You also have a bit of a family connection to the State House.
Yes, a couple actually, Scott. Probably most prominent is my mom, Marion Milne, who was a legislator, Republican legislator from a conservative Orange County district, actually the same district where the Take Back Vermont movement was born after civil unions was passed. My mom, as she said, she never imagined she was going to be a crusader for legislation like civil rights, like civil unions, but it was handed to the legislature by the Vermont Supreme Court, and she did her due diligence and came down very firmly that it was the right thing. And she made this speech as she voted for civil unions that if her entire and announced that a lot of her announced that a lot of her colleagues would be likely defeated if that law passed, and she knew that she might be losing her seat, and she really enjoyed it. But I think her quote was something like, if my entire political career is judged by this one vote, I will have served the citizens of Vermont well by casting it. And talked a little bit more about that. She went on to go from being top vote getter in her district to getting crushed and not reelected. So she's probably the most known. She was a 3-term legislator, woman legislator of the year a couple times, and did a lot of great things. My dad was a 1-term legislator and then ended up spending about 50 years on and off in the House Clerk's office. Right. And then, not to bore you with Vermont trivia, but I love Vermont history. People, particularly up here in the Kingdom, I think remember the 100 years of Republican rule between, the Civil War and Phil Hoff's election. No Democrat had been elected as governor in Vermont in that 103 years, I think, or something. Right. Contrary to that, in Barrie, Vermont, first labor unions in the country were in Barrie. Barrie in the 30s had a last socialist mayor in America. There's a little bit of conflict about that, whether there was somebody in Milwaukee in between, but clearly the last socialist mayor in Vermont before Bernie Sanders was in Barrie. It was very much a Democrat between the Civil War and 1938. No Republican had been elected to the House of Representatives from Barrie, but my grandfather was also a one-term legislator,
Really?
Republican elected from Barrie, and then went to run George Aiken's office in Washington for a while. So he was and my first memories actually of being in Newport as a little kid were coming up here fishing with my grandfather. And that's sort of how I got turned on to Vermont history and Vermont politics, was spending time talking about it over a fishing pole with my grandfather, and some of those cherished memories are right up here in Newport. So it was fun times.
You mentioned some of the famous people who came out of Barrie. Well, we got one of them. He's either famous, infamous, or depending on how you look at it, is former long-serving local senator Vince Aluzzi.
Oh yes, yes.
He's a Barrie boy.
He's a Barrie boy, and of course, I thought you were going to, until your descriptives threw me off a little bit, but Phil Scott is a Barrie boy as well, right? And a little interesting trivia for you, if somebody wants to Google and prove I'm wrong on this, it'd be fun to know. But as you recall, in 2014, when I was running for governor, Phil was running for lieutenant governor.
Right.
So this is leftover trivia from 2014, but I believe if I am elected lieutenant governor and Phil, who looks very likely to be reelected as governor, but if we serve concurrently as governor and lieutenant governor, I believe it's going to be the first time in American history that a governor and lieutenant governor who graduated from the same high school are serving together. So there's a little Barrie trivia for you.
Did you overlap?
Yes. Phil's a year ahead of me, and his cousin actually, I knew of him. We weren't didn't hang out together, but I knew of him. His cousin's actually a very good friend of mine. So his father, interesting story, which I don't think I'm violating any family confidence. My very good friend's mom and Phil's father were siblings, and they grew up in Washington, Vermont, where I grew up. So I heard a lot of stories about Phil's father. Actually died when Phil was about 10, so I never met him, but heard a lot of stories about Phil's dad and growing up in Washington.
He was a combat veteran who lost his legs in the war.
Yeah.
So, not to make this about Phil, but I can't interview you without mentioning COVID-19. And how do you think the governor's doing, the state's doing, and the people are doing at handling this?
Yeah, I think it's a real something that Vermont should be proud of. That we're doing as good a job and maybe a better job than any place else in the country. I think Phil's demonstrated that he's good at building teams of highly credible and highly qualified people, and I don't know about getting out of the way, but making sure that he's letting them have a voice. And I think Dr. Levine has got to be one of the more credible people in a state anywhere in the country right now. So I think we're really fortunate, and I think there's concerns right now, especially we're seeing maybe folks coming in for leaf season that were a little careless, but we've got this resurgence going on that we need to pay attention to. It. Hopefully it's not going to be two steps back for our economy, but I believe, Scott, that there's an opportunity going forward to build on that brand a little bit. There's a lot of good things about Vermonters' brand. We're hardworking, we're environmentalists, and now I think we've got a little bit of a brand of being one of the smartest states, safest states in the country for dealing with COVID. And I think as Lieutenant Governor, there's a thread of opportunity there to weave that into a strategy for strengthening our economy as we move forward.
I'll tell you, I'm not an expert, so, and I at least admit it, there's been a lot of second guessing the governor by a lot of people, and just COVID has brought out a lot of frustration. But I have a son who works in the edges of the healthcare world in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And they have a state where its governor has chosen, from his point of view, transformed COVID-19 into a political football. Instead of looking at the people, instead of looking at it, she's chosen to use it for political gain. And unlike Vermont, which with Governor Scott and his team, they have slowly, as they call it, opened the spigot and allowed people to live a life Maybe not perfect what we want, but the governor there has just totally, practically shut down everything. And it's gotten to the point now where she has shut down people for so long that people now are just saying, we give up, we're going to live our lives. Thus, now the numbers are going right through the roof. And so that gives me a little more perspective on what, that the governor's probably doing the right thing.
Yeah, and I think we're all learning a lot. Just in my business, I think one of the assets I bring to potentially bring to Montpelier for potential voters is my experience in the private sector. Travel and tourism is the largest employer of people on the planet. It's one of the largest parts of Vermont's economy. We thought we were being, when you just think about, we thought, we actually shut down offices before the government forced us to, because we realized that losing some money was bad enough, but killing somebody's grandmother was not something we wanted to have on our conscience. And particularly have an office in White Plains, it's more of a currency exchange office where there was a lot of money going back and forth. And it just seemed like that was so that was the first place we shut down. And then, gradually, and by the time we got to sort of halfway through, the state started forcing us to shut down. But, we decided, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't want to, kill somebody's grandma. But we thought we were being extraordinarily conservative, Scott, and we said, let's plan on having zero revenue until September. And then as we get into the fourth quarter, we'll be back to 50% of revenue from where we were in 2019, which everybody else in our business was saying we'll be back to 50% by June. We thought we were in the 90th percentile of conservative. Right. And now we're saying it's going to be next July before we're back to 50% of 2019. Oh, yeah. It's a disaster right now. Our business is down 90% still. Right. And so it's, nationally, American Society of Travel Agents thinks that somewhere between 70 and 90% of travel agencies are going to be gone for good. I think, back in April, the Small Business Administration or U.S. Chamber of Commerce maybe, I think, predicted that 25% of small businesses, employers with less than 500 employees were not going to survive this. And I think people are not paying that hasn't hit home yet, what that's going to do to our economy and what it's going to do to our tax base and what it's going to do to just the stability of Vermont. Something I'm looking forward to getting my sleeves rolled up and getting to work with Governor Scott to try to figure out how we're going to conquer. One quick thing, Scott, because I know we have a lot of time, but I just want to, Progress VT is a 60-idea plan I put together. You can go to scottmilne.org, check it out. It talks about the 10 basic areas I think we need to focus on with improving government in Vermont for Vermonters, and particularly for getting our economy and our demographic crisis and all these other issues that we need to get moving in the right direction and start making progress on. Do you
want to run them down real quick, or at least the highlights?
Sure.
Or?
Well, the three of the ideas that I think have gotten the most press, Scott, are eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits and military pensions, protecting our seniors, particularly our most vulnerable seniors, the military pension tax removal. It's not really a lot of money for Vermont, but it'll help us bring a new generation home of young military retirees with a skill set or entrepreneurial vision. We talk about simply just looking at, and again, this is how businesses are successful, right? We just looked to New Hampshire and said, what do they do better than us? And one of the things they do better is they have a little bit less red tape around the way child care centers operate. Just by changing some of the red tape on child care in Vermont to what New Hampshire's doing, New Hampshire families spend about 13% less on a weekly basis for child care, spend a lower percentage of their annual income on child care. So that's something we took from New Hampshire. Of course, something that's vital up here in the kingdom is expanding rural broadband, in addition to, waiting for Washington to solve the problem for us, which I think is going to be the long-term solution. Right. Needs to be a national program for all of rural America to catch up. But in the meantime, we've got specific ideas about using community development block grant funds, federal funds, to help fund it. Removing taxes from the networking equipment, sales taxes, to attract investment from the big players to do that. We've got specific ideas on that. Other things that I think are important up here in the Northeast Kingdom, we talk about removing Act 250 jurisdiction from recreational trails. We had that, big problem up here. That'll be great for our outdoor economy. Our outdoor economy is good for tourism. Tourism is good for our overall economy. We talk about removing Act 250 jurisdiction from ancillary businesses on farms. which I think, again, is going to be good for our farmers and good for our outdoor economy, good for tourism and things. There's other, I could run through more if you want, Scott, but I'd encourage people to take a look. There's 60 ideas.
And where can that be found again?
scottmilne.org, and if you just go right to the front page ribbon there, it's Progress VT.
Right.
Please, and if, I got a phone number there, a personal email.
Right.
Get a question, shoot me a message. I'll get back to you.
You know, how many times have you been asked about how you feel about President Trump's conduct?
You know, about his conduct, I don't get asked as much as I wish I would, because that's at the core of my history of support for President Trump. But if you're asking me about President Trump, you're the third meeting we've had today, and you are the fourth question. Both meetings and one person I ran into in a gas station stop. So right. We get asked about President Trump an awful lot.
How many times has media asked you about the conduct in the last 4 years of the Democratic Party?
I don't think I've been asked about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you struggle being a Republican with the media, with the news media?
Well, Scott, there's that 100-year-old saying that don't get in an argument with somebody that buys ink by the barrel.
Right.
So I'll share a story with you, right? About 20 years ago, I'm at an airport opening in New Hampshire with Graham Rudman, who you might remember Warren Rudman, who was a New Hampshire senator who was, famous for the Graham-Rudman Act, prominent New Hampshire senator at the time. His chief of staff were there, and we just had this fun conversation, which was, if you think back to 1960, Vermont and New Hampshire were arguably two of the most, or maybe the two most conservative states in the country. This time, I think this was probably late 90s, maybe. By then, New Hampshire was purple. Vermont was clearly, had become a very liberal state. And the conventional sort of wisdom that most people talk about is Bernie Sanders and a lot of, folks that immigrated to Vermont in the 60s came here to, be free and didn't really, brought their politics with them. And that was the beginning of the change of politics in Vermont. Whereas in New Hampshire, which also had a big immigration boom in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of those people were folks that were escaping regulation and taxation in Massachusetts, but came with their businesses or their jobs. So that's sort of a simplistic version of what a lot of people were saying. And I was sharing with this gentleman who was, again, Warren Rudman's chief of staff, and his comment was, well, there's truth to that, but don't take too lightly the impact of media, particularly over a generation. And his point was that in the 70s and 80s, the primary media source in New Hampshire was the Union Leader, which is one of the most conservative publications in the country. And in Vermont, it was the Burlington Free Press, which is one of the more liberal publications in the country. And I think his secondary point was, as the in the 90s started happening, as the Free Press's power started to wane, a lot of that was taken over by Vermont Public Radio.
Right.
So without specifically commenting on your question, I would say that Warren Rudman's chief of staff agrees with you. There's a direct connection between the news diet that we consume and the politics that we end up with. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's important for folks to listen to a diversity. I have a great memory of about 15 years ago, I think she was probably a 7-year-old niece. We were watching TV and she goes, Uncle Scott, are we watching the Democrat channel or the Republican channel? Right. I think if that's the way that we're going to get delivered our news diet, we got to make sure we're consuming both of them.
Unfortunately, I started my world in the media with the Chronicle and Barton, and because of my work at Recording History and being out there, I often get. It's funny that the news world actually thinks I know something, and they contact me, and it's so funny because. Like I'll get big news organizations contact me. Sometimes it's just looking to contact other people, trying to figure out. But then sometimes they'll ask me questions, and occasionally, like I remember the Washington Post called me, and I listened, and I says, "You're not looking for you're not looking for somebody to give their opinion. I said, I already know what you're doing. You're looking for somebody, you've written the article, and now you're looking for somebody to fill in the blank to go along with the article you've already written. And that doesn't happen often, but Washington Post has done that. Reuters have done that. I can usually tell if a reporter really wants to know, or if they're just doing, okay, we need somebody with this to go along with our opinion. And so.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Scott. I had a similar experience with business. I was a speaker at a New York Times travel show maybe 10 years ago.
Right.
And for about a month and a half, I would get 1 or 2 calls a week from a reporter saying, hey, we're working on a story about, whatever, or something. And 90% of them I disagreed with. I go, no, we haven't seen anything like that. I don't think that's true. And then I'd read the paper, and there'd be a story there where they'd find somebody to say it's true.
Absolutely.
And then they stopped calling me.
I am going to give a shout out, though, to one reporter. I think he's the grand man of Vermont reporting, probably the longest serving one, Mike Donahue.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Mike Donahue's been on my show, and, he's been reporting since I was in diapers, and he has given me the lowdown on the evolution of news reporting in the state of Vermont and in the nation to the degree, and the evolution, or whether you want to call it de-evolution, but I find, even when I disagree with him, he's a huge asset to this state. And even though I did read, it was announced on WDEV of his passing. I don't know if you heard that. He had to go on to the internet, and he just wanted to let people know that he is alive and well, because somehow WDEV earlier this year announced his passing.
Oh, gosh, it's funny. I've actually talked to him in the last few days, and he
was very much alive, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was alive.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's great about Vermont. It's a small state, and your reputation matters, right?
Right.
And he's got a reputation of just being a fair guy and a smart guy and a hardworking guy.
And what is right, and wrong is wrong. And he'll tell you that he's had some people mad at him, but he lets the chips fall where they may, and that's it. Okay, 2 more minutes. What do you have to say?
Well, I think the Northeast Kingdom's an important part of Vermont. It's a part of Vermont we need to cherish. I think, like a lot of parts of Vermont, we've got this Montpelier-centric government that thinks it knows everything, and is way too often you got the same 100 people down there that just talk to themselves and tell themselves how smart they are. It's clearly not the level it was in the Shumlin administration, because we got Phil Scott there, but Phil Scott is the last guy standing. I mean, it's been 10 years since we've had more than one Republican elected statewide, and I'm not a scary Republican. I'm cut from the cloth of George Aiken and that Aiken-Gibson wing of the Republican Party, where George Aiken sat and had breakfast with Mike Mansfield on a weekly basis, the leading Democrat, the leading Republican in the Senate, so they could figure out what was going to happen that week. That's the world I imagine. I think Vermont can take a good step in the right direction by electing Scott Milne to work with Phil Scott, because there's a lot we need to do, and it's, again, in Progress VT. A lot of Democrat ideas in here that are good ideas. I'm coming in walking the walk of what I'm talking about, which is I'm going to be a bipartisan person, going to work with Phil Scott to support his agenda and get Vermont going in the right direction. But I'm also going to be reaching across the aisle and working with Democrats and pulling them in so we can have solutions that are working for everybody, and not, it's somebody's good idea is somebody else's bad idea. Let's just get to work on ideas that are good for everybody. And I think there's an opportunity. I think I can be part of the solution. I'd be honored to serve as Lieutenant Governor if there's an opportunity.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Be with you, Scott. I'll see you again, I hope, either as a private citizen or Lieutenant Governor here, there, somewhere, and okay. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.